friends, it's Sarah, and it's November, so it's time for another nonfiction book recommendation video. So I filmed this earlier today when I still had sun coming out of the window over here. But the camera just decided to quit and not save any of the footage. So we're restarting this video. There's going to be a very dramatic light change after my first little bit here, but we must soldier on. November in the book community is nonfiction November, and the past couple years I've made videos recommending nonfiction books to y'all, and I want to keep up that tradition this year. Last year, I just talked about books that I read in the previous year, and the one before that, I talked about my all-time favorite nonfiction books. And so this year, I am doing another year-long nonfiction book recommendation. So these are all books that I've read in the past year, so last November to today, which is November 20th. I've sorted them into 4 different categories, so hopefully there'll be something for you in here. But the first category we're going to start with is memoirs. So first up, I have All the Beauty in the World, The Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me by Patrick Bringley. So Patrick Bringley worked as a guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for several years, and this is his story. It is a memoir, so he does talk about like his personal life, which I don't know why, but for some reason that surprised me. But he talks about his personal life, losing his older brother to cancer, which was actually what prompted him to quit his job and then get a job as a guard at the Met. He also talks about art appreciation and like the different like thoughts and feelings that art can cause us to have, and kind of his journey of the different ways he's appreciated art throughout his time as a guard and just like his life in general. But then he talks about obviously what it's like to be a guard at a museum, and specifically at one of the most famous art museums in the world. I really enjoyed this book. I think I gave it 4 stars, but what really enhanced my enjoyment of it was that he has his website, I think listed, I can't remember, somewhere within the text. If you go to his website, he has a collection of all of the art that is mentioned in this book, so you can go through and like click on the links to see what he's talking about as he discusses various art pieces, whether they're just mentioned in passing or if he does like a deeper dive into them. So that was really cool to be able to kind of explore some of the Met's collection from afar, from the online space. And overall, I just thought it was quite beautiful. I really liked learning the behind the scenes of what it's like to be a guard. I thought it was really interesting the way he talked about just, you know, what you do for 8 to 12 hour shifts when you're just kind of standing in various spots and watching people and making sure they don't touch art. Because I don't think I could do that. I think it would drive me crazy. I also thought it was very interesting when he would talk about the way that guests would like approach him for questions or for directions or anything, because I personally have never seen a guard in a museum and been like, this is a source of information. I'm like, scary defense person. They are doing important watching work. I don't want to like get their attention at all and get in trouble for, I don't know what, existing in the gallery. Who knows what my fight or flight response is doing, but I never considered that you could ask a guard for directions or anything. I was like, they are a separate thing. But maybe they'll change. Maybe this has changed how I will think about museum guards and think of them as like not just outside security, but as like museum employees as well. So overall, very interesting, and it did make me want to go back to the Met and go look at all of the art. Next up is Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, which I gave 3.5 stars. This is kind of like a tell-all book about the restaurant industry. I had never read anything by Anthony Bourdain. In fact, I really didn't know much about him. I remember hearing when he died, I knew that he had some sort of food travel show, and that was the sum total of my knowledge of Anthony Bourdain's existence. So reading this book was quite the eye-opener for me, because I thought he was just kind of like middle-aged man doing travel food stuff, and did not realize that he was this kind of wild cook and chef in his younger years. Because this was written, I believe, in the early 2000s, so probably at the time I feel like it was not as widely known the chaos of behind the scenes of restaurants, but now with shows like The Bear, which is honestly a big reason of why I picked up this book, you have all that kind of like madness and all the like characters who are kooky and doing really wild things. So the stories probably weren't quite as scandalous to me as they might have been had I read this in the 2000s. I mean, like, if I had been an adult in the 2000s and read it, because if I was reading it in the 2000s, I would have been, like, 4 years old. Anyways, they were still really shocking. I was surprised by all the, like, hard drugs and the cocaine and the staying out late and drinking until 2 a.m. and then having to go to work, like, the next few hours. Absolutely wild lifestyle. Also could not do that. But some of it was, like, familiar from watching chef content. So yeah, that was a fun 3 and 5 stars, a really good look into what it's like to work at restaurants of all varieties, everything from like low-level line cook to working in like fancier restaurants. And the final memoir that I wanted to talk about was What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. I gave this one 5 stars. So Stephanie had a very abusive childhood. She was abused by her parents and then abandoned by her parents, and it's those stories intermixed with her in the present day trying to find a way to treat the symptoms that she's developed as a result of this abusive childhood. So she discovers that she has complex PTSD, which is a variation of PTSD. Usually like your regular brand of PTSD is you've had like one event or traumatic incident in your life that has caused you to develop PTSD. And complex, or CPTSD, is when you've had a long stretch of like chronic or repeated incidents that have given you the PTSD. It's the difference between like having an abusive childhood causing the PTSD and, you know, going to war for a couple of years. And as an adult, Stephanie is like seeking out different psychologists and trying different forms of therapy to try and deal with these symptoms and figure out how to live a relatively normal life. So I thought it was very upsetting, very intense, the stories of her childhood, but also interesting learning about this different aspect of mental health that I had never heard of before. Obviously I'd heard of PTSD, but I didn't know what complex PTSD was, and that was very interesting to see the differences there. I also felt so bad for little baby Stephanie. The stories that she tells about her parents are deeply upsetting and really hard to read about sometimes, but I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I thought it was very well written, very interesting, and it made me feel a lot of very sad feels. So those are the 3 memoirs that I read, and up next we are going to talk about the science books that I read with me from the past. So I'll see you there. All right, so for the first book in my science category, I have The Body, A Guide for Occupants by Bill Bryson. I have read one Bill Bryson book before, and that was At Home, and I loved that one, and I figured I would read this one. It was pretty good. I didn't like it quite as much because I feel like I knew a fair amount of the stuff in it. Like it was, I would say, maybe like 11th, 12th grade biology kind of level stuff. It was still really interesting and entertaining, but it wasn't as like, oh my god, I didn't know that, as his other one was, for me at least. But I still gave it 4 stars. I thought it was very accessible. I thought it was interesting, and I think, yeah, if you didn't take biology at the end of high school, or if it's been quite a long time since you took biology, then I think this would be a great book for you to read to explore what's going on with this body, which a lot of the time the answer is we're not quite sure. Like, it does this. Why? Don't know, but it does. Which was really interesting to read about, that we kind of really don't know much about our bodies. Even though we know a lot, there's still so much that we do not know. Which is fun, I guess. More things to discover. Yay! So the second book that I have is Packing for Mars by Mary Roach. This one I gave 4 stars as well. Mary Roach is I guess like a pop science writer, like science communicator kind of writer, but she is so funny. I really enjoyed her books. The next book is also a Mary Roach book, but I think she's very funny. She picks really interesting topics to talk about. So this book is about science of like going to space, and she always finds like the really interesting stories and kind of digs those out for us. So this one had ones like, you know, how do you take care of your hygiene when you're going on a space trip? There was, she discussed studies that they had done of like leaving people in clothes for 2 weeks, that like if you're, you know, on a ship going around the earth and you can't change your outfit, what is that like? Designing, you know, like how do you go to the washroom in space, trying to figure that stuff out. It's stuff that at least I take for granted, that like of course we know how to do things because I was born after they sent a man to the moon. So I'm like, oh, of course we just know that these things, you know, how gravity works or how being out of gravity affects you. But like they really didn't know anything, which of course is obvious, but I never really thought about that. So I thought this was a really interesting book to really think about what it was like to try and figure out how everything would affect the body and how you would do all this stuff while in zero gravity or while in space. And yeah, it was just really good. And like I said, my next book is also by Mary Roach, and that is Stiff, The Curious Life of Human Corpses. This one is, I would say 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. I'm very squeamish, but like something about corpses and like forensics really interests me. Not sure what that says about me, but there are a lot of chapters about kind of like what happens to your body after you die, like decomposing and all that stuff, but also like jobs that corpses have. So if you donate your body for science, that can mean like a wide variety of things. Like, you know, you can donate your body to be an organ donor and have transplants happen, or you can donate your body to science and like they do experiments on you, but also like your body could end up being a kind of crash test dummy for a car manufacturer to see, you know, how different impacts, whatever, would hurt a person in there. Because there's only so much they can do with like actual crash test dummies, that they can't tell how it would affect a human body with all of our weird squishiness and our bones and everything. So that was fascinating. I loved the chapter where she talked about kind of like plane crash forensics. They like studied plane crashes to try and figure out what happened to them, and the way that like dead bodies in the plane crash, sorry, this is going to get a bit morbid, but the way that the bodies were in the plane crash could tell you about what happened. Like, you know, did a bomb go off? Well, if a bomb went off, then there would be a lot of like highly fragmented bodies around a specific area, like where the bomb had gone off, and then they'd be more intact the further away from the bomb they were. Or she was talking about places where they teach about like, you know, decomposition, and they would have take bodies and like bury them in different areas and different types of like soil or like a swamp or whatever, to see what that would do to a body, like how it would decompose differently, so that when investigators are trying to like solve murders and stuff, they would be able to have this wide breadth of knowledge of like, oh, if it's done this, then like it's maybe been in this type of place for this amount of time. And it's just like really interesting. So even though you're dead, your body can still keep working. Yay! But you don't get paid. But I just thought this was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know, I would say like 90% of the stuff in here, so that was really interesting. And again, she makes it funny somehow, even though we're talking about death and corpses, and it's kind of macabre and like kind of heavy stuff. People don't like thinking about mortality, but this was just really interesting. She also talks about like different things you can do with your body after you die. You know, like, do you want to get cremated? Do you want to get planted into a tree and grow into a beautiful tree after you die? Lots of fun, interesting little stories. As you can see, I have some tabs here about some of the more interesting things that I found on here, but would highly recommend. Very interesting and bizarre. Up next, and the final one for the science category, is Fireweather, The Making of a Beast by John Vaillant. This is about the 2016 Fort McMurray fire in Alberta, as well as about climate change and kind of like the forces that came together to cause this beast, the making of the beast. This one I gave 3.5 stars. It was kind of a weird read for me because the first little bit focuses on like oil sands and like the oil industry in Alberta. And I am from Alberta and I have been my whole life, so I know a fair amount of the stuff. Like some of the things were interesting. They were talking about how in the oil sands they have these like crusher things that could crush, I think they said a city bus within like 3 seconds, which was wild. And like I've never been to to site, as they say, like up north to where they are extracting the oil. I don't work in the industry, so I've never been up there and witnessed these things, so some of that was interesting, but I do find it like a little slow at times because, you know, talking about like the Hudson's Bay Company, when like colonialism was first happening, and it's stuff that I learned in my history books. So the first third, I was like, yeah, I kind of know this, and I like know my dad, who has worked as an engineer on different pipelines. He tried to read this and was like, I just kind of know this stuff. So he ended up not reading the rest of this. But the middle part, I think, is where this really shines, especially if you are, like me, familiar with the oil sands and that kind of industry. The middle part is about the fire and is a more like zoomed in look at this with perspectives from people who were either citizens of Fort Mac or were firefighters at the time, and is a really intense and interesting and kind of scary look into what that fire was like. That part I really loved. I thought that was excellent. It was very gripping. It read like almost like a disaster movie. It was very, very engaging. And they talked about things like the flashpoint of like when a fire just will crumble everything down within seconds. They talked about all the weird firefighting they had to do because it was such a crazy big fire that they couldn't use normal firefighting techniques, and that also, you know, a lot of them were town firefighters versus like wildfire firefighters. How many times can you say fire? And how they had to like adjust techniques. There was a guy who was like, I'm gonna stay with my stuff. I have all these like motorbikes and I like have welding stuff, and this is kind of like my pride and joy, and I'm not gonna leave. And he stayed with his stuff and he managed to save it, and then he looked down the street and the fire had stopped and was coming back at him, and he was like, okay, just kidding, I gotta get out of here. Just wild, wild stories like that. And really devastating stuff. Obviously 88,000 people had to evacuate in a like very little notice. It was an absolute tragedy. So many people lost their homes, and yet no one died, which was absolutely incredible. And thank goodness for that. But yes, the middle part, so good, so interesting. And then the third bit of it, the last third, was more broadly about climate change and kind of the factors that had created the world that we live in, that created the fire. And this part again was like a little slower because you go from that like insane action, everything's so fast and like intense and action-packed, to a like broader history of climate change. And it was interesting. I did learn some stuff, but it also was like, yeah, I know climate change is real. I understand that. I live with the effects of it. We're all witnessing it right now, currently. It's November 20th, and this is the first week that we've had like a big dump of snow. We had one little bit of snow in late October, and this is the first dump of snow we've had that has stayed, which is wild because it used to be when I was a kid, it would have snowed and stayed before Halloween, and you'd have to wear your stupid little parka under your costume because it was too cold and snowy to go out without it. So I'm living in the climate change world. We're all living in the climate change world. But it was also a very interesting look at the history of climate change science, and like, we've known about climate change for a long time. We've known about the effects of greenhouse gases for a lot longer than I thought. Like, there are people in the, like, I want to say it was the 1700s, 1800s that were talking about the effects of CO2 on the atmosphere. And Big Oil was like, but that's not profitable, so shh, shh, shh. So that part was also interesting. But I think the first part was kind of like 2 stars for me. The middle part would be like 4.5 stars, and then the end was like 2.5, 3 stars. So we have, with all that math, come to 3.5 stars. So the next category I have is books that will make your blood boil. The first book in this category is not as intense as some of the others, and I thought was kind of a bridge between the science and the blood boiling. Interesting sentence there. But that is Wordslut by Amanda Montell, and this was a 4-star read for me. So this is, again, kind of like a pop linguist book, I guess you could say, where Amanda Montell looks at the way that women's speech and vocabulary and speech patterns and like voices have been really demonized, and why this is, and like why it's wrong. And it's really interesting. It really made me think about language. She talks about things like insults that are gendered, but that used to be not gendered. So for example, slut used to mean untidy and was used to refer to both men and women, and now, of course, is a derogatory term for a woman who sleeps around a lot. Like, even when you're applying it to a man, most people would say, like, a man slut, assuming that a normal slut is a woman. Not great, and also came from a just kind of like normal word for everyone. I'm sorry if you can hear background noise. The air is going because it's cold. There are now the people snow blowing the sidewalks, which is very lovely, thank you, but why didn't you do this earlier in the day and not now at twilight, which happens at 4:05? But whatever, so we're gonna have to push through because my camera's got limited battery, I've got limited light outside left, and then we gotta get this done. She also talks about the ways that women and men tend to speak within their gendered groups. So women tend to speak more horizontally, that is more collaboratively, we're building a conversation together, whereas men tend to speak more vertically. They're trying to establish dominance within that conversation and not really working together, which I thought was very interesting. Of course, this book is written with very man versus woman. There's not much room for anyone else on the gender spectrum. It's a very white feminist kind of look at this, which I mean, Amanda Montell's white. As long as you are aware of that and you aren't expecting anything else, just know that going into it, she's mostly just talking about white women and white men. It's like pop science-y kind of, so it's surface level, but it was really interesting. There are lots of things that made me think about the way that I speak or the way that I think about other people speaking. So that was interesting, good kind of something to get you thinking about language and speech and the way that we judge people on those. Next up, I'm going to talk about Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Radden Keefe. I literally just finished this book today, so fresh in my mind. And this I gave 4 stars. This was actually one of New York Times best books of the century, so that's really cool. But this kind of follows 2 strands throughout the book. Most of it, I would say, focuses on the IRA. Again, zooms in on some people who were part of it more than others. Dolores Price and Brendan Hughes and Jerry Adams, kind of people who were higher level, that were more prominent figures in the IRA. But then the second strand follows the kidnapping of Jean McConville, and she was a widowed mother of 10 children who was taken from her house one night and never seen again, and her children were like, what the heck happened to her? Obviously this was a big trauma in their lives, and they had a whole bunch of issues with behavioral issues and alcoholism and stuff later in their lives due to this, and I'm sure also the other conditions in which they grew up. But this was really interesting. The one thing I would say is I was not really familiar with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So I would have liked, I think, maybe to read just a little kind of Wikipedia overview of everything that was going on before reading this, because they do talk about it, but I think having that kind of pre-knowledge would have been very helpful for understanding more deeply what was going on here at first, because I was like, what's happening? Yeah, but I thought this was very interesting. It was very, again, pretty intense stuff going on in here. Bombings, shootings, lots of torture, beatings, interrogations. Not just by the IRA, but also the British were torturing people left, right, and center. Really very interesting, well-written, well-researched. And I really enjoy Radden Keefe's writing. I think he writes in such an engaging way that, yeah, he says it's not a history book, it's a narrative non-fiction. And that's really what it feels like. It's these people kind of telling you the story. It is also now a series on Disney+, so I will also go watch that after making this video, probably. But I'm going to take a peek at that as well. Up next, we have Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, which I gave 5 stars. I had, I want to say about a month or so, a very intense obsession with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. I listened to the Dropout podcast, and then I read this book, and then I listened to the follow-up podcast to the book that follows the criminal trial, and then I also watched the Dropout series featuring Amanda Seyfried. I don't know how to say her name. But I spent like a lot of time thinking and reading and consuming media about Elizabeth Holmes. But if you do not know, Bad Blood is about, as I said, Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos, which was a blood testing company and was also an incredible scam run by Elizabeth Holmes. So basically, she was a dropout from Stanford, hence the podcast and the show called The Dropout, who came up with this idea that she wanted to invent a machine where you would use a drop of blood to test for everything that blood tests test for. So instead of having to get blood drawn from your arm in little vials to test different things, you would prick your finger, give a drop of blood, and they could run every single test on one machine on that drop of blood. Which sounds amazing. It's such a great idea. It would be so nice for people who have to get blood tests. You know, it sounds lovely. Unfortunately, she could not make this happen, and she had this huge company, and she just lied. Personally, I think she wanted this to happen, and she thought if she could just, you know, keep the scientists researching, keep getting money, that like eventually they would get there, and she just kind of needed to like bluff her way to getting the product. You're playing with people's health and lives, and you can't do that. But anyways, this book was written by John Carreyrou, who is a journalist, and he was the one who kind of broke the story about Theranos being fraudulent and not actually working the way it said it did. And it is like mind-blowing. This is, I think, maybe a new favorite nonfiction subgenre. Like, I love a con book where we talk about the way that people do these crazy scam things. Because like, I love Smartest Guys in the Room about Enron. This one is incredible, and I just like, oh my god, it makes your blood boil. It makes you just absolutely question every system in the world. But my main takeaways from this book were basically that these like high-level investors, where she got a lot of her money from, it's really like a networking thing. It's a who do you know who will give you money. A large part of the reason that she managed to get so far with this was that she made some good contacts. She like through her family and through like being a very charismatic and charming person, she managed to get all these old men to give her a bunch of money because she had a couple people vouch for her, and she just managed to, you know, you get a couple people on your side who hold a lot of sway with these high-level investors, and you can get so many people to give you money for this thing that they don't know about. So yeah, it really made me question like stocks and, you know, investors, and like, do they even know anything? Because it sure doesn't seem like it. But anyways, it was a fascinating book. It made me very upset because, you know, she's trying to do this, trying to get all this fame, and is doing it at the expense of all these poor people who are hoping that, you know, this is something that can give them answers to like health questions. There were people who were getting false cancer diagnoses. There were people who were taking tests and it was like, oh, you are actually miscarrying, and they weren't. And so people were making really big life and like health choices based on these fraudulent and incorrect test results that Theranos was providing. So absolutely wild. Would highly recommend this book. I think I listened to it as an audiobook actually, and that was really good too. But man, oh man, was that a wild ride. And the more I talk about it, the more I want to read the book again. So we're going to stop there before I go out and buy this book. The final book in this category is Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I gave this one 5 stars as well. It was a recommendation from a coworker. And again, ooh girl, it made me so mad. This is about women who worked during the wars at a watch face like dial painting factory where they would use radium to paint the faces on watches so they would glow in the dark. And at the time, radium was not known to be as dangerous as it is, because when they discovered it, they're like, oh, it like cures cancer, like kills cancer cells, so it kills the bad things, so that must be it's good for us. And there was all these crazy products like skin cream that had like radium in them. absolutely wild. There were stories in this book about the women going to the factory in their like going out clothes so that they would get all the radium dust on them, and then when they would go out dancing later that night, they would like glow in the dark, and it was very cool and pretty, not realizing of course that this was going to kill them. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about that in the beginning, and then as we got further in the book, when they started to develop radium poisoning and all the symptoms associated with that, it got really horrifying, and I almost threw up reading this book because some of the symptoms are really upsetting, and I'm not going to talk about them here, but if you do not like body horror stuff, even though this is nonfiction, I would say there's a bit of that in this. If you are sensitive about teeth in any way, but reading about teeth or like jaw things, do not read this book because I almost threw up. And it was really hard to read. And then, following that, I almost threw up reading about their experience trying to get care and trying to get a diagnosis and then trying to get compensation from the workplace where they were exposed to all this radium that caused all these horrifying symptoms. It made me feel nauseous in a like righteous way, you know? I was really mad for them. It was absolutely infuriating. I felt so bad. And yeah, this one also just made my blood boil, made me so mad to read about these poor women who were misled for a long time, for longer than they should have been, because at first it was honestly like, you know, they thought it was fine, and then it was like, we knew it was maybe not fine, but we just didn't tell them. Again, about like the way they would like paint the dials is, you know, they had to be very precise, so they would they called it lip pointing, where they would put the brush in their mouth to like point the, you know, the bristles of the brush so that they could get a more precise tip. And so that is why they had all the mouth problems at first, why those were like the first things, because that was where they were getting maybe not a lot of radium at a time, but every time, you know, you point your brush, you dip it in the paint, you draw it on there, and then you point again. And they were doing this several times per dial. That's a lot of radium that you're consuming at the end of the day. It's something I knew nothing about, but I feel like I learned a lot. All right, so my final category is cold adventure books. We only have 2 books in this category, and the first one is Endurance by Alfred Lansing. This is about the 1914 trip by Ernest Shackleton and his crew to try and get to the South Pole, and it goes horrifically wrong, of course. This was actually written in 1958 by a guy who was just like really obsessively interested in this journey, and he did like all this crazy research. It's really well written, it's really well researched, and then he published it and it did fine, and then it got republished, I believe in the 80s, and it really took off and sells a lot even today. Obviously, like I bought this copy, and yet he died in 1975, and so never really saw the success of his like truly like his passion project. It made me so sad that he didn't get to see how this book did take off, because it's really well done. He did a great job. So Alfred, like congrats, kudos to you, man. But I actually read this with my boyfriend, and we read it like physically, but also as an audiobook, and the audiobook was really good too. It was read by this like, sounded like an older British man, and it was lovely. But this was just an absolutely wild survival tale in the Antarctic. And the craziest part of it all, I would say, and like spoilers, but they all survived. They all made it back, which is so wild when you think about the absolutely insane conditions they went through. I can't even remember how long they were there, but it was like over a year that they were stuck in the ice and then trying to like get back to land to be rescued. Absolutely wild. So good. If you're in the States, apparently Disney Plus also, I promise I'm not sponsored by Disney Plus, but apparently they have a documentary because they just a couple years ago discovered the wreck of the Endurance, which was the ship that they were on, like under the ocean, on the ocean floor. So if you're in the US, you should watch that. I'm in Canada, so I can't watch it, which was very sad because I got fed maybe an ad or something, I can't remember, about it, and I was so excited to go watch it because I love this book, and then it was like, it's not in Canada. So ads target me better. I'm in Canada, not the States. Only show me things I can see on Disney Plus Canada. But anyways, this book was really good. I guess it's actually a combination between like the Mount Everest books I like to read and the Titanic books I like to read. We've got the cold and the ship sinking and the survival aspect of it all. So this was kind of like the perfect marriage between the two. The next book in this category I gave 4 stars. And it's a similar thing. It's called Empire of Ice and Stone by Buddy Levy, and it's the disastrous and heroic voyage of the Carreyrou, which was the ship that took the 1913 Canadian Arctic expedition team to try and head towards the North Pole to do science. This one I would say is maybe not written quite as well, but was still very gripping, still very engaging. They're setting off to do science, things do not go well, and spoilers, only 11 of the 27 people on this ship survived, so really rough. Unfortunately, a real letdown compared to the Shackleton book level of survival. This is another series of incredible acts of survival, of really harrowing conditions, and also more specifically focuses on the leader of the expedition and then the captain of the ship, who are two very different men. One really comes out as a bit of a hero and the other one is kind of the villain of the story, I would say. It's a very different experience from the Endurance. If you read them together, it's very well prepared, well thought out, well organized, and kind of slapdash. A lot of the situations they were in were because they were not well prepared, and the leader of the expedition was just going for the glory and not really making plans to make this successful for everyone, not really taking into the account the weather and the ice and the fact that you cannot predict or control the weather and the ice on the Arctic Ocean. Very good book, again, very interesting, and another great cold ship adventure. And then finally, as a palate cleanser, in no real category, just for fun, I have an absolute casserole, the Taskmaster Compendium by Alex Horne and Jack Bernhardt. This I purchased because I love Taskmaster so much. It's all I think about almost all the time. I've convinced several coworkers to watch it so that we can talk about it at work. And this is a book put together by Alex Horne, the Taskmaster's assistant, as well as Jack Bernhardt, who is one of the hosts of the People's podcast, Taskmaster, the People's Podcast. And he's kind of like the stats man. So this is a collection of different like stats and like lists and rankings, as well as behind the scenes stories about like how the show got started and what it's like to like film in it. It's very fun. It's for the Taskmaster hardcore fan in your life. I ordered this from the UK so that I could get a signed edition, and there it is, signed by little Alex Horne, which I think is very cute. And I just thought it was so fun. It's a great way to relive excellent moments from the show. There's the Ed Gamblery, where he's picked out his favorite art from the show, talks about them. There's facts about eggs. There's Alex Horne's speech for getting an honorary doctorate. There's, throughout this, they talk about the first iteration of Taskmaster, which was at the Edinburgh Fest, as like kind of it was a year-long series of tasks that Alex Horne set comedians, and then during the festival, they would do the like basically the studio part there. And so like that was really interesting to see the way that the tasks have like changed and the way the format has changed. And it covers the first 17 seasons of Taskmaster. It was written obviously before season 18 came out because that just finished, so that's not in here, and Junior Taskmaster is also not in here, but it was great, it was very fun. And it's just like a great little thing to have around for the Taskmaster fan in your life. A great palate cleanser from all of the very heavy books we've been talking about prior to this. So I loved it. 5 stars. It's made especially for me, a big Taskmaster fan. But there we have it. Those are the 13 nonfiction books that I have really loved this year. Hopefully there's something in there that you would enjoy too. Thank you so much for joining me and for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Now go read a book. Also, do you like my Pizza Miss shirt? I bought it for this year's Pizza Miss. Nerd Fighters Rise Up. It says, "Get a hot like Pizza John," like Chapel Roan, but Pizza John. I love this shirt a lot. Read one Bill Bryson book before. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. Not stories. I feel like I shouldn't say stories. It's nonfiction. And you, I give 5 stars for being so cute.